Hey everyone, welcome to the Galen webinar series for July. I'm a new face to this. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the founder of Project MedTech, which I'll dive into here in a second. But I just wanted to welcome everyone to the, like I said, July Galen webinar series. A few housekeeping items for everyone listening. If you're not familiar with Galen, you'll be able to check out check them out in a couple different ways, right? So they're a cloud connectivity platform specific for medical device. There's a couple handouts on the right or left side of your screen, depending on the configuration. You can click and download those. And from if you want to check out their website, it's www.galendata.com. So you can check them out there. Follow them on LinkedIn, whatever you want to do. Again, like I said, I'm going to be the host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini, founder of Project MedTech. Project MedTech is a informational company right now. So we have a podcast series that we host where we try to get more information on hot topics in the medical device field. There are two series, one that focuses on raising capital in the medical device space, and another that just focuses on hot topics. So you can go to www.projectmedtech.com. You can search for Project MedTech on your favorite podcast platform. Whatever you want to do, it'll pop right up and you can check it out. And if you want more information on Galen, conveniently, Chris DuPont, the CEO and co-founder of Galen Data, appeared on an episode. So if you want to check that out, you can give that a listen. We dropped the link in the chat function, so you could check that out. Tom, do you just want to give a brief introduction to who you are, what company you're with, and what you do?
Thanks, Dwayne. First of all, hello, everybody. I'm Tom Hughes, a Senior Principal Advisor for Health Economics and Reimbursement here at Labcorp Medical Device, as I said, Medical Device and Diagnostic Group. But before I get into a little bit about my background, I want to say thank you to Galen Data, Paul and the team there, Chris, Alex, as well as you, Dwayne, for putting this presentation together. I see we're up to about 35 people and growing, so this is a topic of interest. As I said, I oversee health economics and reimbursement for the Labcorp Medical Device Group. So this presentation is focused strictly on medical technology, not drugs, even though we're part of Labcorp, which is an international organization. And so I'm headquartered here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm just looking at something here. So I've been in the medical device industry about 25 years. My education background is in healthcare law, but I moved years ago to MedTech. I love the area. Minnesota has a lot of big and small medical device groups. So our team of experts here at the Labcorp Device Group is composed of people that came out of the device industry. I'm part of a broader group inside the device group here. We have regulatory experts, and a very large clinical team that can help device companies large and small, move through the process. As a CRO, we can help in all areas. I'm not here to make a pitch, folks, but I wanted to put what I do in context for you. As I said, I've been in the device industry for 25 years at the Labcorp Device Group, almost 5 years now. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation and getting into the details. But right now, I'm going to spend about 40 minutes talking about this slide presentation. And at the end of that, we'll have roughly 20 minutes for Q&A. And I promise you, I tend to talk a lot, but I have my trusty clock here in front of me. A couple other things Dwayne already mentioned, chats. And so Dwayne will be able to look at those, and sometimes if Dwayne thinks it's important, he may ask a question if it's relevant to a specific slide I'm going through. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end. So my focus today, as I said, is going to be on Reimbursement 101 is what I call it. So these are the three areas I'm going to be talking about. I have about 30, 35 slides. And so the first section is really important. It's going to, those of you who said you have a general understanding, which is I hear about a lot when I have intro calls with companies large and small, inside or outside the US. they often say the same thing. So this is going to help you give a little more foundation. Obviously, in 40 minutes, you're not going to get a lot, but you're going to think of the questions to ask about, reimbursement. And then I'm going to move from there into my second section is, okay, you have a foundational understanding. What can you do to develop a reimbursement strategy? Because I presume that's partly why you folks are on the call. And then critical in this brave new world of healthcare and understanding the value of technology, because all the stakeholders I'm going to talk about, that's what they care about. Next slide, please. All right, thank you, Dwayne. So this is really what I'm going to go through today. What are the payers thinking about coverage of a new technology? And that could be an innovation of an existing product you have. What kind of codes will be used? How will it be paid for? I'm going to get into this in some detail. And then who pays? Oftentimes companies don't think enough about that. And the reason that's important for somebody like me who spent many years, helping companies figure out reimbursement, reimbursement will vary by the site of care. So you have to think hard about where you think your primary sites of care will be for your product. And oftentimes it's multiple sites. We'll get into that. This will affect your ability to offer your technology during early commercialization, as it says there. Next slide, please, Dwayne. All right. You're going to hear a lot today, and hopefully we'll have some good chance to have some back and forth later on. But I think if you have one mental image you can take away with you, this is a good one. It's called the three-legged reimbursement stool, because oftentimes I'll get calls from some companies or people who've done their homework on Google and say, Tom, I'm feeling pretty good about reimbursement. I have a code. And I said, you don't have reimbursement. You have a code that may or may not be the right code, because there are literally thousands of codes in different areas that you have to think about. Good effort, and it may be correct, but that's only one element of reimbursement. Now, the other critical element is how much payment is attached to that code. And that's usually done by the payers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then critically important is you could have a code, you can have payment for your product, you still don't have reimbursement. You have that unless you have that last critical element, and that's coverage. I'll get into what I mean by coverage in the next series of slides here. But essentially, the bottom line for coverage is what do payers say about it. When I talk about payers, I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's government and private payers. All three of these elements are necessary before you have a product or procedure associated with your product or technology that will be reimbursed. If you don't have this, if you don't have coverage and coding and payment, I think I'm stealing thunder from my next slide, but I'll say it anyway. What you have is self-pay. You don't have a third party willing to pay for your technology. And I presume that's why many of you are on the call wondering how that foundation works. Next slide, please, Dwayne. Okay, here's a little better description of all three elements. Coverage is a decision by a payer to pay or not to pay for your product or service, and it varies by payer. Medicare is a key payer. Private payers like Aetna and Blue Crosses of the world are key payers. There are hundreds, if not a few thousand payers throughout the United States. They can make their own decisions. They're not bound by any other payer like Medicare or anybody else. It's a free market, and these private payers can make their own choices. Oftentimes they copy each other, but not always. That's a plus and a minus to you folks, because you may have a payer in one region of the country that is willing to cover your product and another who isn't, but it's more of a pluralistic system. And then the codes. The codes are the language of billing, critical. Whenever you go to Dr. Jones or anybody or your hospital, they're going to bill the payer with codes, and we'll get into those in a minute. There are multiple coding systems I'll be describing. So you have coverage, you have a code. Usually if you have a code, you have some type of payment, but not always. There could be miscellaneous or unlisted codes. But there's usually a dollar amount that's attached to that by different stakeholders in the system, Medicare or other stakeholders. And so there are multiple payment systems we're going to briefly discuss in this first section. And I said each process is distinct. It is somewhat complex in the United States versus single payer systems in other countries. And you have to understand that if you are going to go out and get reimbursement for your technology. And as I said, you don't have these three elements together, you don't have reimbursement. What you have is somebody opening up their wallet and paying out of pocket. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and Tom, just to be clear, I don't know if we made this clear at the beginning. This is for the U.S. reimbursement system,
Thank
correct?
you, Dwayne.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is U.S. I think the first slide says that, the topic slide is U.S. reimbursement, but it's good to verbalize it. We do have people on our team that can work with reimbursement overseas outside the U.S., OUS reimbursement. because US reimbursement is so complex, I focus strictly on that. Me and my team here at Labcorp Device Group focus strictly on US. And this slide kind of ties into that, Dwayne. Thank you.
Yeah, and Tom, real quick before you go on just to nail a quick question we got in, are you gonna be able to send these slides out or not?
No, we can't. We have a policy at Labcorp where we don't just broadcast them out, and that's our corporate policy. But I'm glad the person asked that question, because here's one thing we can do. If you at the end of this slide deck will be my contact information, and I may be able to put in individual slides and send them out, but I'm not allowed to send out the whole slide deck.
Okay.
But the other point I want to make, Dwayne, really quickly is oftentimes after the end of these presentations, companies will still have questions, and I'm readily available, and we often do this at Labcorp Device Group. We'll have a half-hour introductory call. It's just to answer more questions of the company and helping them understand more about questions they may have from the slide deck. So that's another way of getting answers to these questions.
Okay, and I think, and Paul or Alex can correct me, I believe there's a recording to this webinar, so you can always go back and re-listen.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you for those questions, Dwayne, and that's great too. When we're on a topic that's relevant to the slide, I appreciate you jumping in at the time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just quickly go over coverage. I'm in the coverage section of the three-legged stool, folks. So I want to talk to you about who the payers are, because this is a critical stakeholder whenever you're thinking of device reimbursement. So you have to have some foundational understanding. Many of you probably already do, but it doesn't hurt to reinforce it. Private payers, private insurance. These lists here are some of the biggest ones in the United States. Aetna, Humana, UHC, United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shields in various states. Anthem Blue Cross is one of the biggest ones. They own about 5 different plans in Illinois. No, that's actually another Blue Cross plan. Anthem owned California, Indiana, other states, Wisconsin, you name it. So you'd have to understand their policies. That's why I'm telling you all this. Medicare is the 800-pound gorilla. CMS, Center for Medicare Services, oversees the Medicare program. Medicare covers about 30% of the US population. I think anybody over 65 are people with disabilities. But what's critically important to Medicare is they set a lot of the policies that the private payers will adopt, especially the private payers that don't have their own medical policy review team. So Medicare becomes critically important when I help companies understand coverage coding and payment that they can extrapolate from and understand what may be happening with the private sector. Other payers that may be critical at companies depending on your technology are Medicaid. I had a company recently that I had some questions about women who have problems with birth, and a lot of those are underprivileged women, and so often they're on Medicaid, so they wanted to know the reimbursement path through certain state Medicaid plans, for example. Workers' comp, people injured on the job may want to better understand that system. There are different systems from, so there are various, and then military, active and retired military. So bottom line, like I said, payers cover services that are medically necessary. Medicare is required to do this under the Social Security Act of the 60s. And so they have taken that mandate and they've developed their own interpretation of it. And that's, quite honestly, the level of evidence that they're expecting is higher to establish that precedent. Other payers will have their own precedent of medical necessity. That's why it's important to do some more research on what different payers are saying. They're not all the same. They don't have to be, but a lot do follow Medicare. And oftentimes when you read these policies, they'll say, here's the evidence to show that it's medically necessary. And here's, if it's not, they will have language like it's still experimental or investigational for these indications. We're not going to cover it. These, as I said, these definitions vary by payers. Next slide, please. Okay, what do payers want? And when you think about what they want at a very high level, of course, the first thing they want is, are you cleared with the FDA and or approved? Clearance, I'm talking about 510Ks. Approval are usually pre-market approval for the technologies. So they want strong clinical evidence, and that could mean a number of things. And you can read those bullets. I'm not going to go through them in detail. But obviously, the higher the level of evidence for any sort of your work you do, the better opportunities you have payers to look at your technology and have a positive policy impact. And oftentimes when you look at a policy, it's not a red or green light. There's a lot of yellow lights saying, you know, under these conditions, we will cover it. That's great. A lot of you folks with new technologies, I use baseball analogies. You'll see that in a few minutes. What you're trying to do is get a base hit. You're trying to get to first base. You're not trying to hit a home run every time. So don't be too discouraged if some payers are wanting more or less evidence. There's usually some sort of path working on that coverage. And 15 years ago, they looked at the second bullet a lot, strong clinical evidence in this brave new cost containment world we're in today. It's cost effectiveness. They want to know the value. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then they also want, oftentimes you get the power brokers in healthcare are obviously the payers and the hospitals and also the physicians, of course. So any sort of professional society support you have, I know a lot of companies that come to me, they'll have a key opinion leader within a certain professional society that addresses their therapeutic areas. Keep doing that, folks. It's very important for a lot of reasons when you work with payers and or you want to get a new code if there's no existing code. And then avoid overutilization. Oftentimes over the years, I've seen these marketing plans that are critical to success. I understand that, but they talk about how huge the market size is. Be very careful about sharing that dossier with the health plan or payer that's often, or that scares them a bit, right? Because they're thinking overutilization, what's wrong with the existing standard of care and how much overutilization? They're willing to pay for it within limits. So you just got to be careful about how you think about that regarding payers. Investors is a different story. I'm not in that wheelhouse. You understand what I'm saying. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a critical slide, and I think Dwayne touched upon it early, and the question touched upon it early, actually the poll question, when do you start thinking about reimbursement? So I'm asking you to be aware of this. A number of companies, although this is changing, they will start off with, telling me, excuse me just a minute, trying to catch up to my hard copy here. They focus oftentimes exclusively on getting through the FDA, and there may be reasons for that, but more and more they have to start thinking about reimbursement. So this is just a real good diagram helping folks understand the difference. When you're going through the FDA trying to get the regulatory approval and get your submission into the FDA, what the FDA cares about are two things, as we all know. Is it safe and is it effective? Think of the COVID drug, that's what they cared about. And what does the study data say about that? That's what they care about. That's their mandate under law. Move over to the right side of this screen, and that's somewhat of a different story with payers. Yes, they will look at data that may come out of the studies you do if you have to do studies for the FDA, but their questions are different. What do the outcomes look like for your technology versus what's we're already paying for, the standard of care? Why should we adopt your new technology? What data do you have to prove that it's equal to or better than what's already out there? The purchasers that I'm describing here are primarily the hospital systems, because they can buy your technology. In turn, they will bill the payer. So for these kind of groups, and even physicians and outpatient and other facilities, what they're going to care about too is how much does it cost? Because if there's a big copay or things like that, they are very conscientious about passing that cost on to the patient or others. So the purchasers, the hospital systems, especially the hospital systems I'm talking about, they're going to want to know what the cost is compared to it. So the information needs are different. You have to understand those different information needs. The sooner you start thinking about the stakeholders on the right side of this, my right side of here, the payers and the purchasers, you can start developing data early on in the process when you're working through the FDA. One last thing I'll say about the FDA from a selfish personal perspective when I'm doing reimbursement work, I often like to work with the people getting the regulatory submission in right away for this very critical reason. When you're thinking about the indication for use or the intended use of your technology, you can have the same widget maybe used for two different things. One indication may be covered and i.e. reimbursed by a payer or a purchaser, and the other may not. So the sooner I can see what the proposed or actual indications are for this new widget or new technology, the more clearly I can understand and then help a client navigate the reimbursement pathway. So that's very important for you folks to understand. Don't consider these two initiatives in isolation. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Tom, real quick too, just to pipe in, because you brought up the investor side of things, and you were talking about reimbursement, thinking about it early, and I think that's something that almost everybody is probably aware of, especially if you're a small startup and you're raising capital. investors are looking for reimbursement plans early and often as well, right? So if you're out trying to raise money for your startup, you're going to have to come across this. So you're going to have to think about it early. You just brought it up. I wanted to pipe in and make sure everyone is aware that they are asking about it as well.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Dwayne, because that you just remind me of one other thing, then we'll start moving through some of this first part is the most important anyway. I can move through the second and third parts more quickly. But just 1 second back to the FDA issue, and you can, I've heard this from other leaders here in the device industry, Minnesota Medtronic and St. Jude Medical, Abbott, 3M Healthcare. They've had people going out to the JP Morgan conferences over the past years in San Francisco in the spring, where you get a lot of companies going out there talking to investors, to your point. 10 years ago, their first and oftentimes only question out of their mouth of the investors to these companies was, what's your status with the FDA? Now it's flipped. Now their question is, we understand there's a process to get through the FDA. It's cumbersome, it can cost money, but it's clear. We want to know how you're going to get paid for it, i.e. reimbursement. I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please, Dwayne. All right. Okay, coding. This is another important slide. I'm going to go through this. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this because it's really very important. And so there are 3 different coding categories. The first one are CPT codes, current procedure codes. They are created and maintained and controlled as precious commodities by the American Medical Association of Physicians. And there are thousands of CPT codes dealing with evaluation. You name the area you're in, folks: neurology, surgery, wound care, orthopedics, you name it. There's a CPT code that's relevant to the physician and other healthcare professional getting paid. PTs get paid this way, OTs, others. There are codes out there, hopefully for your product and procedure associated with that. And they're 5-digit numerical codes. You see the example on the right. That's an insertion of a pacemaker pulse generator. One example. And so you want to know, is there an existing CPT code for my technology? Because physicians and other healthcare professionals will use these codes in all sites of care: inpatient facility, which is more than 24 hours, outpatient, which is less than 24 hours, clinics, which most of us are familiar with when you go to Dr. Jones and he or she takes care of you and does his or her evaluation and management of your condition. So that's all got associated CPT codes, and that's the way they bill the Blue Crosses and Aetnas of the world. Next group is becoming more and more important. Those are HCPC codes, Healthcare Common Procedure Codes. They're alphanumeric. You can see the example on the right-hand side for defibrillators. These are supplies and biologics and drugs and services not defined by CPT codes. More and more care is moving into the home setting, for example. And so HCPC codes are associated with those products and technologies, a lot of durable medical equipment. You see people with casts and things on their legs. There's a HCPC code probably associated with that. So is this applied to your technology? That's a question you have to ask yourself as you go through the slide. Is it a CPT code? Could there also be a HCPC code? Could there be more than one CPT code? The third row here is critical for healthcare as well. Coding system, International Classification of Diseases. CM stands for diagnosis code. PCS codes are procedure codes. Diagnosis codes are used on all billings, whether in the clinic, outpatient, inpatient, and they're to identify the diagnosis that you have. They moved from 18,000 codes in 2015 to 87,000 these codes to get more specific on the type of diagnosis and procedures. Procedure codes are only used in the inpatient setting, and here's an example on the far right. You have somebody with chronic atrial fibrillation and you have to revise the lead in the heart, for example. They will combine the diagnosis and procedure codes and create what's called by Medicare a diagnostic related group of procedure and diagnosis codes. And that's how hospital bills the Blue Crosses of the world for their services. So we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide.
Hey, Tom, real quick.
Yeah.
Something I hear a lot when I'm talking to clients or other medical device companies is they'll say, well, we don't have a CPT code. We're going to get a new one. And I'm not too familiar with it, but I know it's complex. Can you maybe describe the process of getting a new CPT code? Because it's my understanding it's pretty complex and difficult to do.
It is a complicated procedure. That's why your first step, whenever you're thinking of reimbursement, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, is there anything already out there that we can use? Is there a correct code? It has to be correct.
Okay.
And that's what the homework you have to do or have somebody help you do is. Now, to answer your question, what is the new CPT code pathway? For getting a permanent CPT code that has payment attached to it can take anywhere from 2 to 5 years, depending on how much evidence you have. And you have to go through the American Medical Association, and it's a cumbersome committee on purpose made up of primarily physicians, like I said earlier. They will bring in some payers and specialties, like maybe a physical therapist is part of the group to look at it if it's applicable to that therapeutic area. And there's an application process that is long and detailed that you have to complete. So it is complicated. And so that's all I can say right now, and it'll take some time. This is not the time or place, but it's a great question to help you understand. Now, there are temporary codes that you don't need quite as much clinical evidence to obtain, but they're not paid, but you can get some utilization out of it and build some momentum and get paid on a case-by-case basis.
Great, thank you.
Next slide, please. I know I'm paying attention to the time here. Again, I talked a lot about this. I'm not going to go through a lot of it. You can read it. They're used on insurance claim forms. The hospital system uses a different type of form than the clinics and others. They help the stakeholder, the payer, or whoever's paying for your technology, i.e. payers, ultimately understand what's paid for. They can help gather information on utilization. I'm here in Minneapolis. United Healthcare is one of their biggest growing divisions is Optum, where they gather all this information and they can use it to understand utilization and that sort of thing. So you can read this list. The bottom one is important. You have to understand that the codes have to be correct, and that's a correct coding initiative by Medicare, and a lot of private payers will follow that. And if you're not, I don't see this hardly ever. I don't think I've ever seen it with any of my clients where there could be mistakes in billing. That's different than fraud and abuse. But I'm old enough to remember 60-minute days where you could see an expose on the DME companies down in Florida or Texas that would start getting a billing code and fraudulently billing. When you're taking money away from the American taxpayer for Medicare, you're going to go to jail. Again, that's not an issue here, but I say that because of the importance of understanding correct coding. If you incorrectly code private payers and continue to do it, they would just stop doing business. Next slide. All right, so this is the table summarizing everything I've talked about. You can kind of see where these codes fit in, the identifiers, who owns them at the bottom row there. CMS is Medicare, AMA owns CPT codes, CMS owns HCPCS codes. And so I won't go through this slide too much, it's just to give you an idea of the differences in the coding nomenclature here. Next slide, please. All right, we're on a half hour. I'm going to probably spend another 15 minutes, Dwayne. I'm just giving you a heads up on my presentation, but that's okay. This first section is the critical section. So this is the third leg of the three-legged reimbursement stool I'm going over, and here's what I talked about in my first slide, I think, when I talked about different codes and different sites of care and why it's important for you folks to understand the top two primary. It could be all of them, but I don't see that very often. But where's your technology, your procedure being used? If it's used by Dr. Jones, they're going to use a CPT code in the clinic. And the Medicare payment is they're just going to pay based on the code. One thing that's important is Medicare. We can see their fee schedules, their payment, $100 for a certain procedure, for example. We don't have visibility to private payers. That's a private contract between the Blue Crosses of the world, for example, and the Fairview Health System, or whoever it is that they're contracting with, or the clinic. That's public available. That's usually what we look at, and then you extrapolate. Private payers usually pay 15 to 30% more than Medicare. And then the payment methodology, non-Medicare, is the same. Go through these rows, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. ASC stands for ambulatory surgery centers, which are growing. You go in a day and out in less than a day. They start with CPT codes, but like with the hospital inpatient, they lumped them into ambulatory payment classification of codes for Medicare because they're using CPT codes together. Medicare was paying too much for individual CPT codes. A lot of private payers are following that payment methodology. Inpatient, I talked about ICD-10, and you have the diagnostic related group of these ICD-10 diagnostic and procedure codes wrapped together by Medicare, and they will pay, for example, a CABG procedure, coronary artery bypass graft. I can't remember the exact detail, but I remember one time it was $25,000 Medicare would pay. And what they do is they combine the diagnosis of the procedures for everything that's used, including your technology, if it's a defibrillator, for example, or whatever they use in a procedure. they will include the cost of that technology in that DRG for a Medicare patient. That's why cost is so important to the hospital systems, because you add a new widget to that bucket, that their profits are less. You have to understand why you're important, why your technology is going to save them money down the road. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. HCPC codes I've talked a lot about. There's a separate fee schedule by Medicare. The private payers will follow that. Oftentimes paying a little less than Medicare for HCPCs versus CPTs, probably for the reason I mentioned, that AMA is powerful and these other codes aren't as critical to them. I'm not sure the reason, but that's the way it's turned out. Next slide, please. All right, moving right along. I've already talked about this. Medicare, I just talked about that one. That's the visibility we have to their fee schedule. That variability is with private payers can vary all over the country and by plan and by the contracts they have. I already talked about how they set their fees versus Medicare. I talked about a lot of this. You can take a quick glance at it, and then we can move on to the next slide. All right, a quick case study, folks. I started off this section by saying you don't have reimbursement unless you have coverage, coding, and payment. This is a real world example for a technology I worked on many years ago for a non-implantable neurostimulator for people with incontinence, that women especially who've had a number of children will have stress or urge incontinence, and they historically have done manual Kegel exercises. So this company I was working with got a code for the product. They got a HCPC code. It was an alphanumeric code. They said, yippee-ki-yay. And then Medicare came back and said, yeah, that's good, but we don't have enough evidence supporting coverage, so you don't have reimbursement. So we went back to work with this company, and those variables that you see, important factors, were critical. We had to overcome some of those hurdles. And then the action we took, we worked with a key opinion leader, a physician at a major university, to do a double-blind study. We got support from the medical societies that worked on this area and patient advocates in Washington. And we eventually got positive coverage. Now this 5 years, they weren't working at it full time. That's probably a little longer than it may take normally, but the bottom line is the key learnings. You don't stop when you get a code, you don't quit. There's other things you can do. You have to, a critical variable here is that second bullet, you have to have a well-designed trial to get coverage, as I've spoken about earlier oftentimes. Sometimes you don't, it depends on the technology if there's already good data out there, but it's normally very important. So my point of this slide is, don't think you have a reimbursement just with a code. All right, next slide, please. All right, now you've just kind of learned the basics. I know some of you knew it already, of coverage, coding, and payment equals reimbursement. And so how do you think about this as your company, as you're thinking through this, listening to me? So this is what this next section is about. Next slide. I'm probably showing my age on this slide a little bit, but it's a great movie. And some of you may be looking at this and scratching your head, and others say, oh yeah, I know that. That's from Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. When he built this, he heard this voice and said, if you build it, they will come. And so this famous or infamous Chicago White Sox team that lost the World Series, they came out of their spirits came out of the cornfields, and because he built the baseball field, and they played baseball there. So it's become a catchphrase nowadays. So I like to use it because that's true with us. Next slide, please. If you build your technology, and I hear this a lot, and when I was inside industry, people get so excited about their technology, and rightly so, because you're thinking, you're the creators, I'm not. You people are devising, and the engineers and all of the innovators on your team coming up with these great new ideas. Do not forget, the bottom line is you can build it. When I talk about they here, I'm talking about the people I just talked about. Who are the critical stakeholders that are going to buy it? Is it the Medicares of the world, the Medicaids, the workers' comp? Is it the private payers? Is it some, those are the major groups. And how do you show them that this is worth paying for? Next slide. All right. So I already mentioned this idea 10, 15 years ago. Most companies and investors thought of the dark blue line as early as possible, regulatory, clinical, marketing. That light blue line, reimbursement, is moving further upstream every year. More and more companies are realizing, like you folks did on the phone, hey, we got to start thinking about that ASAP. So It'll affect how you design your technology. Sometimes I worked with an Irish orthopedic company about 8-9 years ago. They designed an orthopedic. I looked at the codes and I said, if you just make this little switch, you can fit inside that existing HCPCS code. I said, oh, it was an easy fix. Now that doesn't happen necessarily very often, but it's an example of why it's important to think of reimbursement. Another more important reason is no matter what, you got to think of what could be the potential reimbursement path and indications for use as you stand now, so you can take steps to think about fixing it. So let's move to the next slide. Should be done in about 8 or 9 minutes. This is an important slide because this is another step in developing your efforts to think about a strategy. Our team does this a lot. It's that first big rectangle. You have to understand the current landscape for your type of technology, because if yours is totally disruptive and innovative, you're not going to have something exactly like yours. But you can learn a lot about similar types of technologies or products or procedures. And what you have to do is what I just described in the first 35 minutes of this presentation. You have to understand what the CMS and private payers, Medicaid, et cetera, are saying about your type of technology. You have to do a coding analysis. What type of codes may be applicable in different sites of care like they talk about? What can you expect as payment? And then what are the competing technologies others do? And then you come up with findings and recommendations. When I do it, it's often a report. Sometimes I don't have to do a full-blown report. I'll do another general consulting to help them understand it. But if it's a full-blown reimbursement analysis you need, it's often a report, whether your internal team does it, me or others, from anywhere from 10 to 20, 25 pages, depending on the complexity of the technology. It really is a good overview to help you know where you stand today in the reimbursement realm. And then you decide next steps. What do you need? Do you need anything else? Do you need clinical? Do you need health economic strategies? So you develop your plan to work forward. And I'll get into the plan on the next slide. This is an example of a plan. It's an example actually I used. I'm not going to name the specific technology, but this applies to a lot of technologies. And the takeaway from this slide, folks, is, and a lot of companies don't start thinking about historically reimbursement until post-launch on the far right. You have to start thinking about that right away. And as early as possible, when you start thinking of the FDA process, and I'm not just saying this as a consultant, I'm saying as somebody who's inside industry and a number of companies like you folks, and you have to start thinking about at least setting aside some budget and developing some expertise in this area ASAP. Even if you want to sell your product to a larger company. I was speaking at a neurotech conference a few years ago in San Francisco, and I talked to a couple of startups. And then I talked to a representative from Medtronic who was there, and he said, I asked him, I said, well, do you like to know about reimbursement? He said, well, we're large enough, we can do a lot of this ourselves, but it's nice to have this information in some way, shape, or form from a company when they come to us. It tells us they've done their homework. So that's what that second row is for. You can collect a good, helpful data when you're starting out early, especially if you think about the FDA. What you can do at that time to augment it with secondary endpoints if you have to do a study. And you can start thinking earlier about what payers want. And those other elements there, I'm not going to go through each one. You can kind of see them for yourself when you should start thinking about them. Another thing you can do is even building up post-launch. If you understand it right away, you can get case-by-case support by payers. You don't, again, have to hit a home run. You can get a base hit by different payers, and they will pay with enough evidence on a case-by-case, even if they don't have a formal policy. Next slide, please. We have 20 minutes left, and we have about 8 slides left, and we're in the third section here, Dwayne, just so you know. This last section is becoming more important in this brave new world. Over the years, I've been part of a national medical device trade association called AdvaMed in Washington. They've created information on this in the For What It's Worth department. Also here in Minnesota, it's a very well-known organization called Medical Alley that has a lot of good resources for people in the Midwest, but there are others in different states. I realize that. Those are 2 of the ones that I'm familiar with. So let's talk a little bit about what it means when I talk about, you could have a code, you could have payment, but you have to demonstrate the value to get coverage is really kind of what I'm focusing on here. Next slide, please. Okay, you may have heard about this. This is what happened in 2010 with the Affordable Care Act, whether you agree it or not. People on both sides of the aisle agreed there were problems in healthcare. I mean, there were poor outcomes compared to some of the other countries. So the goal of that act was to improve quality. People can disagree on whether these 3 critical elements have been met yet. and how much. But this is what's driving changes in healthcare and value-driven healthcare by AdvaMed and other groups that are working to, with medical technologies, help them demonstrate value. Value means all of these things. You got to improve outcomes, you got to sustain, reduce rising costs, and expansion of access was a big issue and still is for people who can't afford existing normal employer-based healthcare services. Let me back up a minute to that middle arrow there. The healthcare costs, an important anecdote I like to reference during these presentations is this one from Kaiser, which is a well-respected think tank, also has a Kaiser Permanente plans throughout different states in the United States. But they do a lot of data gathering and publication of information. I don't know how old this is, a couple of years. They said by 2023, at the rate we're going, healthcare costs will amount to 23% of GDP. So that's darn near a quarter of all costs. So when you're thinking about this technology and utilization for your product, that's what payers and other hospitals are thinking about. So they're all from the state of Missouri, where the license plate says, show me proof that it's valuable. That's how they're thinking, folks, and that's the purpose of this slide, to help remind you of that. Next slide, please. All right, here's where you want to be in this brave new world of cost containment and demonstrating of not only economic but clinical value. Back in the old days, you may have been okay lower down on the far right, demonstrating clinical value, but not anymore. So this is the goal, folks, with your demonstrating value for your technology. And there's different ways you can do that. Let's go through what these mean in a little more detail. Next slide. Okay, clinical effectiveness, I've touched on this, and this is the foundation. Medicare really technically, legally, under the Social Security Act, can only look at clinical. They can't ask you about the cost, although they have ways of doing it. But what that means essentially is, okay, you have a technology or a product or a procedure. How well does it work versus what we're already using? I've talked about that. That's what I mean by clinical outcomes. You can get data to support that with outcomes. Versus in the existing alternatives. By the way, I'm not a health economist. I have people on my team who do this stuff, and I have medical advisors who came out of the payer world who can help me with this information, and other people at Labcorp. So I oversee this stuff. I'm well versed in reimbursement, but I go to others to help me understand the second bullet especially, which is cost effectiveness. And that is, how much does this course of action cost compared to the standard care? I already explained why that's important with the Kaiser example. Next slide. All right, this is kind of a good table. Some of you may have seen it before. You want to be, with your technology, you want to be able to show the stakeholders, payers or hospitals, whoever they are, physicians also, of course, that your technology fits ideally in the lower right-hand corner. It's cost-effective, highly effective, and lower cost. But you can get by with less than that, as you see on this table. It can be equivalent in certain situations. It can be less costly and less effective, but for appropriate patients who really may need it. That seldom happens. And then in the upper far right, it can be very costly and very effective if the outcomes are really great compared to existing alternatives. This is just sort of help you understand what others will think about when they look at your technology from a cost perspective. Next slide. Okay, well, how is it used? I've talked a little bit about it. If you have really good economic data, value-based data, it can influence payers, and Medicare especially, saying, you know what, here's got really good outcomes, and it's cost effective. We show there's, and by that I mean, you can gather data, you know, it reduces use of medications for alternatives. It reduces return to the hospital. Medicare has quality of life indicators saying, if your patient comes back with X period of time, you're going to get dinged for it, and we're not going to accept it. Think of the orthopedic market, where there was this whole initiative a few years ago, I think it's still going on, where hospital systems, if they did total knee or total hip, they were going to get a bucket full of money. They could keep what they saved. And then if they went over, they're not getting any more than that. So that's all the whole theme of value analysis. And then market access, defending your pricing when you have to go in front of a hospital value access committee and say, I think you should switch out the existing defibrillator for mine, for example, because mine works better. Maybe it costs a little bit more now, but you're going to save other costs down the road. We have data to support it. Next slide. It's Q2 are almost done. So here's a good example of what I'm talking about. When you think about it early, it can help you. This is a real case. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it's a, what if I talk about, no, it's another technology on the final slide, one of the final slides. So if you think about your reimbursement goals early on, especially if you're thinking about doing some studies at the pivotal trial phase for FDA, sometimes feasibility phase of it, think about, at least ask some folks about what can I gather here as part of my effort to demonstrate to the FDA that my technology is not only safe and effective, but build in some secondary endpoints to show that gather data from the claims showing over however long the study lasts, that this technology also could improve some outcomes, because we're seeing the codes and the claims come back with, when they use my widget, it's not costing as much for return to hospitals or other follow-up procedures or other medications as it is for other widget A that's already been on the market. That's what I mean here. Here's a classic example. This one company had an implantable technology. It was before they came to Labcorp. They did their clinical trial for the FDA. Implantable means they had a lot of patients. It cost them a lot of money. What they did not do at that time is pull data that could help them with reimbursement. So they had to come back to us later on and say, can you gather this data? So we had to go back and open up the, go back to the sites, go back and identify the patients, get them to sign another release of information and start gathering this data on them. If they had this may not apply to you folks, but in this particular case, I think rough figures, don't quote me on this, anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50,000 additional for this large study. They paid more than $500,000 to have it done later on. So it can save you money if you think about it early. That's what this slide's about. Start thinking about it, may not apply to you, at least give it some consideration. Next slide. Okay, here's a classic example. I gave you kind of the last case study was, gee whiz, we didn't get reimbursed because we didn't have coverage, so we had to go back and get it. Here's a success story. This is high frequency chest oscillation. It's a technology. Actually, there are 3 companies in Minnesota that produce it now. It's for often people. It started off. It's for people with cystic fibrosis. It's a generator hooked to a hose and a vest, and it just vibrates your chest so people don't have to pound the backs of people. And there are about 70,000 people with CF, and it works wonders at that, plus medication, plus better hospital care, has prolonged the life of CF patients from the teens of 40, 50 years ago to their 40s, 50s, 60s nowadays. But the company is saying, you know what, there's only 7,000, how do we expand the patient population? So we went back to work, did some more homework and got some studies. When the action we took and the company took are on that action bullet area there, you can read that. And long story short, we were able to get some acceptance of the study evidence data from some private payer decision makers who had contacts with Medicare, and they added what happened is that the coverage expanded from 70,000 to roughly 600,000 patients with muscular dystrophy. So that's a success story when you do things right, or you figure out coverage coding and payment. Next slide. We have about 10 minutes, and I think these are my final thoughts. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. You can read this. Each one of you has different interests when you heard me talking. These interests can constantly change every year. We had breakthrough status with the FDA that may affect companies, but then CMS held off on that. We had some questions from companies on that. Some of you may be thinking of digital health and telehealth. CMS just came out with a bunch of remote patient monitoring codes recently. Surprise, surprise. I thought other private payers would be ahead of them, but they're not. So that added some opportunity for companies that are going into the cloud and down to the physician office where the physician can build CPT codes for those. Pay attention to what's happening now. Make it a priority. That's pretty much it. Don't just wait till the end, because you're hurting your opportunities to get paid for your technology if you do that, and you can increase your opportunities if you start early. That's it. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. So I'm going to exit full screen mode here on my screen because I need to be able to look at these questions, and for whatever reason, I'm having a little bit of difficulty. So we had some questions come in, Tom, for you. And the first one was, when do you approach CMS and payers? At the same time sending 510Ks, prototype phase? When would you do it?
Yeah. The answer is it depends. What I think you have to know, it does. I mean, it depends on the technology. Now, some FDA has come up with this parallel review process where you can go and meet with at the FDA submission for your technologies, meet with CMS and FDA at the same time if you have to do a study, and you can meet and they can educate you about endpoints together. And even some private payers have agreed to do that. That started about 3 years ago, and I haven't followed it completely. I don't hear a lot of companies doing that, and I'm not sure why, but sometimes they may be concerned about being asked to do too much. I don't know. I shouldn't say anything about that, but there's an opportunity by the FDA and CMS saying, we understand that you have to start thinking about this early. So what I've noticed, though, is at the very least what I've done, I'll start there. We tried to do a survey of payers, trying to get an idea after an assessment is done, for example, of private payers, for example, if it's a private payer issue, and ask them questions about, what do you think of, and it's usually blinded, so they don't know the exact name of your technology. What do you think about this technology? What are your issues, and what evidence would you like? So you can really get a good understanding to help you move ahead with your strategy. With CMS, you can meet with them individually, and done that before with neurotechnology in the past. So there's different ways to do it. If you want to ask me more questions about that, feel free to contact me at this email address there on my Q&A card.
Awesome. Tom, a couple clinical questions related to reimbursement. So the first one is, are clinical trials always needed to achieve reimbursement, even if they're not required by the FDA? And the second part of that is, how do you plan, if they are required by the FDA, how do you plan early enough to design those trials to satisfy both FDA and CMS/payers?
Talk to somebody who's an expert on this, can help you. Let me start off with, are they always needed? Sorry, I jumped ahead of myself.
Yeah. Yep.
No, they're not always needed, but you should do again, I hate to say this, but it's the truth, like my last slide before this one says, it depends on your technology. Is your technology something that's already pretty well accepted, but you have a different way of presenting it, so payers and hospitals aren't going to ask many questions about it? The more sophisticated the technology, first of all, the more risky the technology, then the FDA is going to ask you for studies. If the FDA is asking you for some studies, then that's the time to start thinking about what can I do as part of this FDA study, as my other slide here talked about with company A and company B, where actually same company, I should have made that clear, but they waited too long to gather data for the other stakeholders in this world, not just the FDA. So think about it. If you have to do a clinical study, think about what you can do as far as secondary endpoints to gather data that will be important to your audience. And you know your audience by doing a reimbursement assessment, figuring out what is it the private payers and or Medicare, Medicaid, what issues would be important to them. You kind of do a survey, then you can gather the data working with health economic and reimbursement experts.
Okay. Another question that came in was, what is the best strategy to get your product in front of payers? This person's product is covered by CMS and they qualify for MIPS, but I need to get in front of the large payers. What's your best advice for them?
So it's covered by Medicare, then you probably have a code and payment, and you're looking for the coverage, finishing up reimbursement by establishing that coverage leg of the reimbursements to with private payers. And the best way to do that is you're going to have to put together what we call a dossier. And then you want to get somebody who has contacts with payers. And I'm not again, I want to be very careful when I'm talking to audiences like yours about selling my company, but I'm just telling you what I do and we do. I bring in my medical advisor who has contacts with these payer medical directors. That's one efficient way of doing it. So you can get in the door fairly quickly. And that doesn't always happen, but it's peer-to-peer that way. And a former medical director may have contacts. That's one way. You get your dossier together, showing the evidence, putting together your arguments why this should be covered. You set up a time to meet with these folks or send in your information if you can't meet with them right away, and start educating them about your technology. But trials, evidence, you can also do a gathering of existing literature before you even get to that point. So there's a number of things you have to do to prepare that dossier.
Okay. We have a few more questions coming in here, but real quick, I just want to I want to ask Paul a question, and for everyone listening, Paul is the man in the background making this work. Paul, does this automatically boot us off at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 1 o'clock Central? Excellent. It does not. Okay, so we're going to keep pounding through questions. So if people want to stay on, feel free to stay on. I did see one just come through, and it was one that I had written down to talk about as well, Tom. I know I've asked you this before in the past, but it has to do with self-insured. And that's like the self-funded market. Is it correct that they can decide on positive coverage even if private payers and CMS don't?
I believe so. We don't see a lot of that. We track what's
Yeah.
publicly available, which is private, but self-insured is by definition, they can do whatever they want because they're paying for it out of pocket, these big self-insured groups. So
Okay.
they can tell whoever's managing it, oftentimes that are private payers, we want to cover this procedure or this technology. And as long as they're paying for the bill, they can do what they want, is my general understanding.
Okay. And I think for the person who asked that question, if you want to go to episode 15 of Project MedTech, it'll be with Alberto Chan. He's an expert in this area and really covers a lot of that self-funded market. And if you'd like an introduction to Alberto, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can make that intro for you. Let's see here. Next question. Tom, for you, the NTAP process, do substantially like technology have to complete the CMS NTAP application and choose a pathway?
What's that? I'm sorry. That's quite honestly a acronym. I'm not. What is it? What is it? A or I didn't quite hear you there, Dwayne.
NTAP.
Oh,
NTAP.
I know it. Okay, it's not an E. Okay, yeah. That's say the question again. Then
Do technologies have to complete the CMS NTAP application and choose a pathway?
it depends. Sorry, folks. I think it's new technology application process, if I'm not mistaken, and it just depends on whether or not. First of all, you want to find out if there's already adequate reimbursement under existing coverage coding and payment for it before you go to that.
Okay.
If they want to talk about it more afterwards, contact me at that access point if they didn't feel I adequately addressed it. It's kind of hard
Sure.
in the brief time we have, but
Yeah, that's okay, and that's why your email's up. And if people
yeah,
want to ask,
right.
direct questions, then feel free. Tom, someone wants to know, do you have any contacts at getting products into the VA?
Oh, the good old VA. Yeah, do I have any contacts? Not recently, no. That's always changing there anyway, and it is a very interesting, complex process. So maybe that person would also want to. The VA is, you can get into some local VAs if you have connections, and it depends on your technology. If orthopedics, for example, sometimes it's easier than other areas. I can talk a little bit more with you about what you mean by that exactly. Again, I go back to my base hit analogy. You're not going to get anywhere with it. You can get some, there's different things you can do. I'm more thinking out loud here, folks, pardon me. But for example, you got to get on their list, and there's a whole process for that. And then when you're on the list, you have to do other things to get individual regional VAs to adopt it and things like that. So it's not a simple task.
Okay. And real quick, Tom, we have one more question, but for the people who are dropping off because we're at the top of the hour, we asked about slides earlier. If you go to Galen Data's YouTube channel, you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar there and be able to see the slides there, listen to anything that Tom talked about, whatever you need to do. Tom, a question that came in was, do you have any idea on ambulance technology reimbursement?
Some, yeah, that doesn't come up very often, and they could contact me separately about that. It is a kind of again, when you say reimbursement, what, you talk about codes, payment, what they're saying, it could be the type of service you're offering could vary, and therefore all that reimbursement elements will vary.
Okay.
It is an esoteric area, I will say that. We don't touch it too often. I don't think anybody does, but I can maybe guide you a bit.
Okay. One of the questions that came in ahead of time was, and you might have answered this in a way, but still want to ask it, how broadly can CPT codes be used for rehabilitation?
Depends on the telehealth issue you're facing. There's a lot of different types of codes out there. What you mean by telehealth, what you mean by rehabilitation.
Okay.
So I'm kind of using the Socratic method back on you folks. It's probably based on the 3 years I spent in law school. I can't help it, but it's the truth. Contact me. There's a lot of variety. Sometimes these remote patient monitoring codes will apply. There are other telehealth codes that may apply depending again on the procedure and product.
Okay. There was another question that came in, and Tom and I talked about this earlier. You can reach out to Tom. He can get you in contact with the correct person. But there was a question around using an existing drug for a new indication. Tom is not going to be the guy to answer that question. However, there's most likely someone within Labcorp that can possibly help. So if you ask that question, feel free to email Tom directly, and he could try to get you in the right spot. Tom, that covers all the questions that were asked by the audience and mine that I had kind of plugged in the middle. I really appreciate you hopping on and giving this. I think that over the last 5 years, we've obviously seen a huge uptick in the need for reimbursement and investors focusing on reimbursement. And companies in general. So this is definitely a hot topic. It'll continue to be a hot topic. And one of the things that you didn't really mention, but you say quite frequently on calls that I'm on with you, is that when you don't have reimbursement and you don't think about it early, your company just became a really, really expensive hobby, right? Because it doesn't really become anything there. So
Unless somebody, there's some examples of self-pay that can get it going initially, but that's rare.
Yeah, no. So I really appreciate it, Tom. I encourage listeners to reach out to you. Your contact information is up here. I want to thank Galen Data one more time for putting on this webinar series and getting this kind of information out to the community, because it's very much needed. Stay tuned for the next Galen webinar series. It's generally the third or fourth Tuesday of every month. So we're currently talking and working on the topic for August, and that'll be coming out here shortly. And again, don't forget to check out the YouTube channel where you can rewatch this again, or if you need to go back and listen to any section one more time. But really appreciate everyone's time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.